farm had a way of swallowing sounds. At night, when the air settled thick and cool around the fields, you couldn't hear the crickets or the breeze brushing through the corn. The silence was deep, consuming, like the farm itself was holding its breath, waiting. Those who'd worked there for years said the silence was just the land resting, preparing for another day under the sun. But Sam knew better. He had spent enough nights on the farm to understand the difference between peace and something lying in wait. The night it began was just like any other. Sam was doing the rounds, making sure the barn doors were secure, the animals quiet and settled, and that the equipment was ready for another early start. But that night, something felt different, off-kilter, like a shadow out of place. As he walked past the chicken coop, he noticed one of the hens staring at him with its head cocked, one eye gleaming in the moonlight. It should have looked silly, but it didn't. Instead, it sent a prickling chill down his neck, a tiny warning that something wasn't right. Just as Sam shook off the eerie feeling, he heard the first sound, faint, far off, but unmistakable. A low, sorrowful cry drifted across the fields, catching on the breeze before vanishing into the silence. Sam froze, his heartbeat thick in his ears, straining to hear it again. A wolf, maybe, or an animal in pain. He listened, but the sound didn't come back. With a shrug, he walked on, pretending the hairs on his arms weren't standing on end, even though they were. The night was dense and black, like ink pooling over the fields, hiding the farm's usual warmth beneath a cold, unsettling quiet. Sam had just finished his evening routine and was getting ready to turn in when he noticed something strange. His flashlight flickered, stuttering in his hand, the beam wavering as if struggling against something thicker than darkness. He tapped it, frowning, but it only grew dimmer. He was about to chalk it up to a dying battery when he heard it. A soft, slow scratching sound coming from the far end of the barn. Sam's gut twisted. He knew the animals were already settled in. He'd just checked on them. But the scratching continued, dragging along the barn wall, getting louder, more insistent, like claws scraping against old wood. Cautiously, he crept toward the noise, his flashlight casting weak, jittery beams onto the barn floor. The scratching stopped as he neared, replaced by silence so profound that he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He called out softly, his voice swallowed by the darkness, feeling foolish but unable to stop himself. Anyone there? Nothing but silence. Then, just as he turned to go back, something slammed into the barn door behind him. Hard. The door rattled on its hinges, and Sam jumped back, dropping his flashlight. It rolled across the floor, its feeble light spinning wildly, illuminating glimpses of the barn interior. The empty stalls, the loft above, and the scattered straw. Sam scrambled for the flashlight, but before he could grab it, he felt something cold graze the back of his neck. It was a touch, light as air, but so chilling that he froze, his breath caught in his throat. He whipped around, heart pounding, but there was no one there, just shadows stretching deeper than they should, twisting like living things. But then he noticed something wrong. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing at the far end of the barn. It was tall, too tall, its head nearly brushing the rafters, and its form seemed to sway in the dark, as if it were made of smoke and shadow. Sam backed away, his legs trembling, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from it. The figure didn't move, but he could feel it watching him, a heavy, oppressive gaze that pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the figure began to move, gliding forward with a strange, unnatural fluidity, its limbs twisting and stretching, bending in ways no human should. Sam stumbled back, his mind racing with panicked thoughts, but his body was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so intense it felt like his limbs were encased in ice. The figure drew closer, and in the pale light from his fallen flashlight, Sam could make out its face, or rather, the hollow void where a face should have been. Its skin was stretched tight over a skull-like shape, with empty, gaping eye sockets that seemed to pull him in, swallowing him whole. Finally, his survival instincts kicked in. Sam turned and bolted, crashing through the barn door and sprinting across the field, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. But as he ran, he heard it. Footsteps, impossibly close, the sound of something inhuman following him, its long, unnatural strides keeping pace effortlessly. The farmhouse was just ahead, its lights a distant promise of safety. But just as he reached the porch, a cold, skeletal hand clamped around his wrist, yanking him back with an unnatural strength. He struggled, but the grip was ironclad, freezing his skin to the bone. Slowly, he turned, his blood running cold, to see the hollow-eyed figure staring down at him, its mouth stretching open, impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth in a silent, hungry scream. In a final burst of terror, Sam ripped free, stumbling up the porch steps and slamming the door behind him. He locked it, pressing his back against the wood, his breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. Silence fell once again, thick and heavy, as if the very air was waiting. For a moment, Sam thought he was safe. But then, from outside the farmhouse, he heard it. The slow, deliberate scratching, now against his door. Sam thought he'd finally seen the worst of it. But on a cold October night, as he was fixing a fence at the far edge of the property, he began to wonder if there was something darker lurking on the farm, something that only came alive under the harvest moon. The sky was clouded over, casting everything in an eerie, silvery haze, and the air had a strange, metallic bite that made Sam uneasy. As he drove the final nail into the fence post, he heard something faint, almost a whisper, drifting on the wind. It was distant at first, barely noticeable, but as he paused to listen, it grew louder, a soft, rhythmic chant that seemed to come from all directions, echoing across the fields. Goosebumps prickled along his arms. The chanting sounded like children's voices, young, innocent, yet wrong. He scanned the darkness, but there was nothing, just endless rows of corn, swaying slightly in the breeze, each stalk casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. The chanting continued, growing louder, filling the air with an eerie, hypnotic pull that made him feel lightheaded, almost as if he were being drawn toward something. The sound seemed to come from within the cornfield, somewhere deep in the endless rows. Against his better judgment, Sam found himself stepping forward, his feet moving almost on their own as if compelled by the voices. With each step, the chanting grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was thrumming inside his skull. He parted the corn stalks, stepping deeper into the field, his flashlight illuminating only the nearest rows, casting strange shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. As he moved further in, the chanting stopped suddenly, leaving a silence so intense it felt like a weight pressing down on him. And then, without warning, a hand shot out from the corn, cold and rough, grabbing his arm. Sam yelped, stumbling backward, but the grip was relentless, pulling him deeper into the field. Desperately, he twisted around, shining his flashlight on the hand. What he saw was worse than anything he could have imagined. It wasn't a hand at all, not human anyway. The skin was gray and cracked, stretched tightly over bones that seemed too long, too sharp. It was covered in dirt and grime, with fingers ending in jagged, broken nails that dug into his flesh with a sickening strength. Sam wrenched himself free, stumbling backward, but as he turned to flee, he realized he wasn't alone. Figures were emerging from the corn all around him. Shadowy, distorted shapes with hollow eyes and twisted, unnatural limbs. They moved with a jerky, puppet-like motion, their heads twitching and turning in ways that defied human anatomy. Some of them were dressed in tattered farm clothes, others in outfits that looked ancient, as though they'd been wandering the field for centuries. Sam's heart pounded as he spun around, searching for a way out. But every path he tried seemed to lead him further into the field, deeper into the darkness. The figures closed in, their empty eyes locked onto him, mouths stretched into unnatural, silent screams. He could feel their cold, decayed breath on his neck, hear the soft, rustling whispers as they closed in, surrounding him in a suffocating wall of death. Just as he was about to scream, something caught his eye, a faint glimmer of light off to the side. It was faint, barely visible, but it gave him hope, a chance at escape. He bolted toward it, weaving through the corn as the figures gave chase, their footsteps soft but relentless, growing louder with every step. He burst out of the cornfield and found himself standing in front of an old, dilapidated barn he'd never seen before. The light was coming from inside, flickering like candlelight, casting strange shadows across the rotting wood. With no other option, Sam pushed open the door and stumbled inside. The barn was empty, save for a single candle placed in the center of the floor, its flame casting an eerie glow over the walls. But as he looked closer, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The walls were covered in writing, words scratched into the wood with something sharp, deep and angry, as though someone had been trying to carve their very soul into the barn. And all around the candle, arranged in a perfect circle, were small, crude dolls made from corn husks and bits of cloth, each one with a twisted, human-like face staring up at him. As he backed away, he tripped over something soft and looked down to see a pile of bones, old and brittle, scattered across the floor. He felt a surge of nausea as he realized that some of them were tiny, too tiny to belong to an adult. Suddenly, the door slammed shut and the candle flickered, casting the barn into near-total darkness. Sam spun around, heart racing, as he heard footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate, coming closer. In the dim light, he could just make out a figure standing in the doorway, blocking his only escape. It was tall, its face hidden in shadow, but its eyes glowed with a malevolent red light, burning into him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Slowly, it raised a hand, beckoning him forward with a finger that was far too long, ending in a sharp, pointed nail that gleamed in the candlelight. Sam backed away, his mind screaming for him to run, but his body felt frozen, trapped by the creature's gaze. The figures from the cornfield began to shuffle into the barn, filling the room with their twisted, empty faces, their silent screams echoing in his mind. He was surrounded, no way out, the walls closing in as the candle flickered one last time, plunging the barn into darkness. And in that darkness, he heard a voice as cold and hollow as the grave, whispering his name. The nightmares had been coming for days now, clawing at Sam's sleep, making him dread the night more than anything he'd ever faced. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw twisted faces and heard faint, echoing whispers that followed him deep into sleep, leaving him shaken and exhausted. Yet nothing prepared him for the horror he was about to encounter on this night. It started with a strange smell, something rotting, sickly sweet, seeping into his bedroom from somewhere outside. It was thick and cloying, filling the air and making it hard to breathe. When Sam opened his eyes, he found the room bathed in a dim, unnatural glow, like moonlight tainted by something darker, spilling across the walls. He bolted upright, his pulse racing, but the moment his feet touched the floor, the sound of footsteps echoed from down the hall. Slow, shuffling, like someone dragging themselves along. Sam reached for his flashlight, heart hammering as he clicked it on and stepped into the hallway. The light was weak, barely cutting through the dense shadows, and the air was cold, colder than he'd ever felt it inside the house. The footsteps stopped, but the smell grew stronger. It seemed to lead him toward the cellar door, which was hanging open, an invitation to the darkness below. He hadn't been down there in years. It was just an old, unused storage space filled with dust and forgotten things. But tonight, something was calling him down, pulling at him with an invisible force he couldn't resist. He crept down the wooden stairs, each creak echoing through the silence, until he reached the bottom. The flashlight flickered, casting faint, erratic beams across the room, revealing a space that felt different, larger, as if the cellar had grown. The walls were covered in scratch marks, deep and angry, as though something had been clawing its way out. And then he saw it. A figure hunched in the far corner, wrapped in shadows, muttering softly to itself in a language Sam couldn't understand. It was rocking back and forth, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it was barely tethered to reality. Sam's mouth went dry as he took a step closer, his flashlight catching glimpses of its face. It was human, almost, but its eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to swallow the light, and its skin was stretched tight over a skull-like face, pulling back in a grotesque grin that revealed blackened, broken teeth. Slowly, it turned its head, fixing its empty gaze on him, and its mouth stretched open, wider and wider, until it was nothing but a dark, gaping void. The muttering stopped, replaced by a silence so profound that Sam's heartbeat was the only sound in the room. He wanted to run, to escape that awful, bottomless gaze, but he couldn't move, as if his legs were rooted to the ground. The creature rose, its limbs contorted and too long, bending at unnatural angles as it began to crawl toward him, its bones cracking with each movement. Just as it was about to reach him, Sam felt something cold brush against his shoulder. He spun around, his flashlight catching another figure standing just inches from him, staring with the same hollow, hungry eyes. Behind it, more shapes emerged from the shadows, filling the room with their twisted, inhuman forms, each one staring at him with a silent, desperate hunger. Sam backed away, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he stumbled up the stairs, but the figures followed, their hands reaching out, fingers clawing at him with sharp, broken nails that scraped against his skin. The door slammed shut, trapping him in the darkness, and the smell of decay grew overwhelming, thick and suffocating. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding him, filling his mind with a strange, insistent chanting that made his head pound. He clawed at the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. The figures closed in, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their mouths stretching open in silent screams, as though they were trying to devour him, to pull him into whatever darkness they came from. Just as he felt their cold, skeletal hands grip his arms, pulling him down, the door burst open. Sam stumbled out, gasping for air, and slammed the door behind him. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed him, growing louder, filling every corner of the house until he could barely think. In a panic, he fled outside, hoping the open air would clear his head. But the farm was different. Shadows moved along the edges of the fields, shifting and twisting like living things, and the sky was darker, thick with clouds that seemed to pulse and breathe. The barn doors creaked open on their own, revealing an unnatural glow spilling out from within. Against his better judgment, Sam approached, drawn toward the light. As he reached the entrance, he saw the source of the glow, a large, circular symbol painted on the floor, pulsing with a sickly green light. In the center of the symbol stood a figure, tall and thin, its face hidden by a tattered hood. It held a long, twisted staff in one hand, and in the other, it clutched something small and writhing, a doll made of straw and cloth, twisted into a human shape. The figure raised its head, revealing a face that was nothing but shadow, its eyes two blazing points of red light. Slowly, it lifted the doll, turning it toward Sam, and in that moment he felt a strange, pulling sensation in his chest, like something was reaching inside him, gripping his very soul. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. The figure began to chant a low, guttural sound that echoed through the barn, filling the air with a dark, malevolent energy. Sam felt himself being drawn toward the symbol, his feet moving against his will, each step bringing him closer to the figure, to the doll that seemed to pulse with life, writhing and twisting as if it were alive. As he reached the edge of the symbol, the figure raised its staff, and the barn doors slammed shut, trapping him inside. The chanting grew louder, filling his head, drowning out his thoughts, until he was nothing but an empty vessel, drawn to the dark figure like a moth to a flame. The moon was full and high, casting an unnatural light across the farm, when Sam heard it, a faint, rhythmic scratching coming from beneath the floorboards in his living room. He froze, listening as the sound grew louder, each scrape and scratch more desperate, as if something was clawing its way up from the earth. The noise had been coming and going for weeks now, but it was never this intense. It always happened at night, and Sam had tried to ignore it, convincing himself it was just rats, or maybe old pipes settling. But tonight, something felt different. The air was thick, almost oily, and the scent of decay seemed to seep through the walls, filling the room with an unbearable stench that made his stomach churn. Unable to ignore it any longer, Sam took a flashlight and pried open a loose floorboard, peering down into the darkness beneath the house. The beam of light barely penetrated the inky blackness, but as he leaned closer, he saw something move, something white and skeletal, twisted and elongated, its fingers clawing at the earth with a frenzied desperation. He stumbled back, heart pounding, but as he backed away, he felt a cold, sharp pain on his ankle. Looking down, he saw a hand, thin and gray, its fingers impossibly long, reaching out from the floorboards, its nails like jagged shards of glass digging into his skin. Sam kicked at it, but the hand held tight, its grip like iron, pulling him closer to the opening in the floor. In a panic, Sam grabbed a nearby hammer and struck the hand with all his strength. It released him with an unnatural shriek that echoed through the room, filling the air with a sound that was more animal than human. He scrambled to his feet, slamming the floorboard back into place, but he could still hear it. The scratching, louder and more desperate, as if whatever was down there was enraged, furious that he had escaped. Just as he thought the worst was over, a low, guttural voice began to chant from beneath the floor, filling the air with words in a language he couldn't understand. It was a dark, ancient tongue, each syllable resonating with a cold, malicious energy that made his skin crawl. The chanting grew louder, faster, until the entire house seemed to tremble, the walls vibrating with an unnatural force. And then, the lights went out, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled with his flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. The air grew colder, so cold that he could see his breath, and a deep, unrelenting fear settled over him as he realized he was no longer alone. From the shadows, figures began to emerge, translucent, ghostly shapes with hollow eyes and faces twisted in agony. They floated just above the ground, their bodies twisted and broken, as if they had been crushed and torn apart. They moved slowly, their empty eyes fixed on him, their mouths open in silent screams, as if they were begging for release from some eternal torment. Sam backed away, but the ghosts followed, closing in on him, their cold, skeletal hands reaching out, their fingers brushing against his skin with a touch that felt like ice. He could feel their pain, their anger, radiating from them like a dark, oppressive force, filling him with a dread so intense he could barely breathe. One of the figures moved closer, its face mere inches from his own. Its eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to pull him in, and as he stared into them, he saw flashes of something terrible. A field of graves, freshly dug, with wooden markers bearing names he didn't recognize. But there in the center was one marker he knew all too well, his own name, etched into the wood, waiting for him. He tore his gaze away, stumbling back toward the door, but as he reached for the handle, it twisted and buckled under his grip, morphing into something cold and slimy, like decayed flesh. A deep, mocking laughter filled the room, echoing from every corner, as if the walls themselves were alive, watching him, savoring his fear. Desperate, he ran to the kitchen, grabbing a lighter from the drawer. He flicked it on, and in the small, flickering flame, he saw something written on the walls. Words scrawled in dark, sticky letters, as if written in blood. Asterisk, welcome home, Sam. Asterisk, the words pulsed, throbbing like a heartbeat, and as he watched, they began to drip, dark red rivulets, seeping down the walls, pooling on the floor. The blood seemed to come alive, writhing and pulsing as it crept toward him, forming dark, twisted shapes, faces, hands, clawed fingers reaching out to pull him down. He backed away, his mind racing, but the house seemed to close in around him, the walls narrowing, pressing closer, until he could barely move. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and he could hear the sound of something slithering through the darkness, growing closer, circling him like a predator closing in on its prey. Just as he thought he couldn't bear it any longer, the blood pooled at his feet, rising up to form a shape, a figure draped in shadow, with eyes like burning coals, staring at him with a hatred so intense it seemed to pierce his soul. The figure leaned close, its breath cold against his skin, and whispered in a voice that was little more than a hiss, "You cannot escape, Sam. You are bound to this place, as I am bound to you, asterisk." Sam felt a wave of nausea as the figure reached out, its hand passing through his chest, filling him with a cold so deep it felt like his very soul was being ripped from his body. He tried to scream, but no sound came, his voice trapped in his throat as the darkness closed in, consuming him, filling him with a terror so complete that he could feel himself slipping away, his very essence dissolving into the shadows. And then, just as quickly as it began, the figure was gone. The lights flickered back on, the cold dissipated, and Sam found himself alone in his living room, gasping for breath, drenched in a cold sweat. But as he looked down, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Etched into his skin, in dark, angry letters, were the words, "You are mine." Sam backed away, his heart racing, but he knew deep down that the nightmare was far from over. He could feel it, a dark presence, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting, watching, biding its time. And somewhere, deep beneath the floorboards, the scratching began again. The last thing he saw was the figure's face, a twisted grin spreading across the darkness, as it brought the doll closer, pressing it to his chest. And then everything went black. The nights had grown unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to absorb sound and swallow it whole. For days now, Sam had sensed something lurking in the shadows, watching him from the corners of his vision. It was always there, just out of reach, like a bad memory he couldn't shake. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he could feel its presence closing in, as if it was finally ready to reveal itself. It started just before midnight. Sam was in the barn, stacking the last of the hay for the night, when he noticed the smell, a putrid metallic odor like rotting meat and rusted iron. He wrinkled his nose, gagging at the intensity of it. As he turned to investigate, the smell grew stronger, almost unbearable, thickening the air around him until he felt like he was drowning in it. Then he heard it, a faint, whispering sound, like dozens of voices muttering at once. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the barn with a low, droning chant in a language Sam didn't recognize. He stood frozen, clutching his pitchfork, every muscle in his body tense. The air vibrated with a strange, dark energy, pressing against his skin, seeping into his bones. A sudden draft blew through the barn, chilling him to the core. The lantern flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls, and Sam's heart skipped a beat as he realized the shadows weren't following the lantern's light. They were moving on their own, slithering across the walls like living things, merging together to form dark, riding shapes that seemed almost human, but twisted, grotesque. The shadows began to take on faces, eyes hollow and mouths stretched in eternal screams. They watched him with a cold, hungry gaze, their dark forms pulsing with a sinister rhythm that seemed to match the beat of his heart. Sam took a step back, but the shadows moved closer, slinking down the walls and pooling on the ground, inching toward him like a dark, living tide. Panicking, he turned to leave, but the barn door slammed shut with a deafening bang. He ran to it, pulling at the latch, but it was locked, the metal handle burning hot under his touch. He stumbled back, looking for another way out, but the shadows had spread across the floor, circling him, closing in. Then the chanting stopped, replaced by a single, low voice that reverberated through the barn, echoing off the walls in a cold, menacing tone. Sam, you cannot hide from us. This land is ours, and so are you. The words wrapped around him, sinking into his mind, filling him with a dread so deep it felt like he was drowning in it. He could feel something pulling at him, tugging at the edges of his consciousness, a dark, twisted presence that seemed to be reaching into his very soul. As he stood paralyzed, the floor beneath him began to buckle and crack, the wood splintering as if something was trying to force its way up from below. He stumbled back, watching in horror as the ground split open, revealing a dark, yawning void beneath the barn, filled with writhing shadows and twisted shapes that reached out with long, clawed fingers. One of the figures rose from the darkness, a tall, skeletal being draped in tattered black robes, its face hidden beneath a hood. Its eyes burned with an unholy light, staring at Sam with a hatred so intense it felt like fire against his skin. The figure raised a bony hand, pointing directly at him, and a voice filled his mind, cold and hollow. Asterisk, you are marked, Sam. The sins of this land are yours to bear. Asterisk. Sam stumbled back, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the words. I didn't do anything, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. But the figure only laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that shook the walls and sent a shiver down his spine. Asterisk, this land is cursed, it said, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. Bound by blood, buried by guilt. And now, it claims you. Asterisk. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around him, cold and suffocating, pressing against his skin like icy fingers. He struggled, gasping for breath, but the darkness seemed to seep into his pores, filling him with a cold so deep it felt like his soul was being frozen from the inside out. As the shadows consumed him, he felt a sharp, searing pain on his chest, as if something was branding him from within. He looked down, horrified to see dark, twisting symbols forming on his skin, burning into him with an intense, unholy fire. He could feel them burrowing into his flesh, marking him, binding him to the curse that haunted his land. The pain was unbearable, each symbol etched into his skin like a red-hot brand, filling him with a pain so intense he thought he might pass out. But the shadows held him, forcing him to stay conscious, to feel every agonizing second as the curse took hold. When the branding was complete, the shadows released him, and he fell to the ground, gasping for air, his body racked with pain. He looked up, dazed, to see the figure standing over him, its eyes glowing with a dark satisfaction. Asterisk, now you are one of us, it whispered, its voice filled with a cold, cruel delight. Bound to this land forever. Asterisk. The figure began to sink back into the darkness, its form dissolving into shadows that seeped back into the ground, leaving Sam alone in the barn, the smell of decay thick in the air. The shadows receded, slinking back into the walls, and the barn grew still, the only sound his ragged breathing echoing in the silence. He staggered to his feet, clutching his chest where the symbols burned beneath his shirt, feeling the raw, searing pain with every breath. He stumbled toward the door, hoping to escape, but as he reached for the handle, a cold, familiar voice whispered in his ear, Asterisk, you cannot leave, Sam. Not anymore. Asterisk. He turned, but there was no one there, only shadows, watching him from the corners of the barn, waiting. He ran to his truck, desperate to escape, but as he started the engine, the radio crackled to life, filling the cab with a low, haunting chant in the same dark language. The symbols on his chest burned with a fresh intensity, and he screamed, slamming his fist against the dashboard as the pain seared through him. The last thing he saw before he blacked out was a shadowy figure in the rear-view mirror, its eyes glowing with a malevolent fire, watching him with a dark, twisted smile. When he awoke, he was back in his house, lying on the floor in a pool of blood, the symbols still burning on his chest, the shadows lingering in the corners, watching, waiting. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he would never be free of them, that he was bound to this cursed land forever. The scratching began again, faint and relentless, a dark, twisted lullaby that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The nightmares had started as they always did, small and creeping, barely brushing the edges of Sam's mind. But recently, they'd become something much darker, dragging him deeper and deeper until the lines between dream and reality began to blur. Tonight, as he stumbled through his sleep, he felt the undeniable sensation that something was pulling him underground. In his vision, cold hands reached up through the soil, bony and clawed, dragging him down toward a gaping black chasm that felt alive, pulsing with the beat of some dark, ancient heart. Sam woke in a sweat, gasping for air, only to find himself not in his bed, but lying on the cold earth outside, right beside the old, twisted oak at the far end of his property. It was as if he'd been sleepwalking, though he had no memory of how he'd gotten there. The air was thick and humid, the scent of decay filling his nostrils. He staggered to his feet, confused and horrified, only to notice something new. Fresh soil, upturned and disturbed, stretched in a circle around the tree. It looked as if something had clawed its way up from beneath the ground, scattering dirt in a wild, frenzied pattern. As he approached the tree, his feet sunk into the damp earth, which squelched with a sickly, wet sound. His heart pounded as he noticed strange markings carved into the tree's bark, ancient symbols that hadn't been there the day before. He couldn't understand them, but they seemed to pulse with a dark energy, almost as if they were alive, shifting under his gaze. He could feel something watching him from the shadows, waiting. He was about to turn back when he noticed it. A faint whisper, so low it was almost imperceptible, like a breath brushing against his ear. He strained to listen, feeling a chill crawl up his spine as the whisper grew louder, turning into a chorus of voices, all muttering the same thing in unison. Asterisk, return to the roots, Sam. Return to where it began. Asterisk. A shiver ran down his spine as he stumbled back, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But as he turned to walk away, he felt an invisible force wrap around him, freezing him in place. His legs wouldn't move, his arms hung limp at his sides, and the voices grew louder, pressing into his mind, filling him with a sense of dread so deep it felt like he was drowning in it. The earth trembled beneath his feet, and with a sudden, violent crack, the ground split open, revealing a deep, gaping hole filled with roots and twisted tendrils that writhed like living things. The roots seemed to pulse, reaching up from the depths, wrapping around his ankles, pulling him closer to the edge. He struggled, trying to free himself, but the roots only tightened their grip, their bark scraping against his skin, digging into his flesh. As he was dragged toward the pit, he saw something moving in the darkness below, an enormous, twisted figure, barely visible in the shadows. Its eyes gleamed with a cold, malevolent light, and its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It was like nothing he'd ever seen, a creature of nightmare and shadow, its form shifting and writhing as it moved. Asterisk, welcome, Sam, it hissed, its voice echoing through his mind like a chorus of the damned. You belong to me now, bound by blood and fear. You have returned to the roots, just as I commanded. Asterisk, the roots tightened around him, dragging him closer, the ground beneath him crumbling away as the creature's grin widened, its dark form stretching up from the pit, reaching for him with long, clawed hands. He could feel its cold breath against his skin, the scent of decay and death filling his senses, drowning him. With a surge of desperation, Sam tore at the roots, his fingers bleeding as he clawed at them, but it was no use. The creature's grip was unbreakable, its power too vast. It pulled him closer, its claws sinking into his shoulders, pinning him in place as it whispered dark secrets into his ear, filling his mind with images of death and despair, of centuries of suffering bound to the land he called home. As he was dragged deeper into the pit, the earth closed over him, sealing him in darkness. The air grew thin, his breath shallow, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. He could feel the roots wrapping around him, pulling him down into the depths, where the creature's whispers filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts, consuming his soul. And then, just as he thought he would lose himself entirely, the creature's face loomed in front of him, its eyes gleaming with a sick, twisted pleasure. "You are mine, Sam," it whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. Asterisk, bound to the earth, forever. Asterisk. He screamed, but no sound escaped his lips. The darkness closed in, suffocating, all-consuming, and as he was pulled into the depths he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he would never be free, that he was bound to the cursed land, his soul forever trapped in the roots of his own horror. Equals 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 equals. The ground beneath Sam's feet had been changing. It wasn't just the unsettling tremors or the soft whispers in the night. It was the very soil itself, alive with something ancient, something that had been there long before Sam inherited the farm. Something had been stirring beneath, clawing its way back to the surface. Sam had tried everything to escape the farm. He'd even sold the land once, hoping that he could distance himself from the curse. But every time he left, the pull of the earth drew him back. It had been a year since he moved back into the house, after the nightmarish events with the tree and the pit that nearly consumed him. Things had gotten eerily quiet, almost too quiet. But Sam knew better than to believe in peace on this cursed farm. The nightmares had returned first, but this time they were different. The shadows didn't whisper, they screamed. Every night, Sam dreamt of being buried alive, of hands clawing their way through the soil, reaching for him, pulling at his limbs, dragging him deeper and deeper into the earth. Each time he woke, his skin was damp with cold sweat, his heartbeat erratic, his body aching from the violent thrashing. But he never remembered how he ended up in the position he woke in. Face down on the cold floor, twisted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. As the weeks went by, Sam's fatigue grew, but so did something else. A strange unease, a sensation that the land was speaking to him, though the words were faint, just beyond his reach. It wasn't until the harvest season began that Sam realized just how deep this unease went. It started with the fields. He had gone to check on the crops, hoping for a decent yield this year. But as he walked through the tall rows of corn, something felt off. The plants seemed to be moving on their own, swaying unnaturally even though there was no wind. The ground was soft beneath his boots, as though the earth had been watered with something far darker than rain. As Sam knelt down to inspect the soil, a chill ran through him. He pulled his hand away in horror as his fingers touched something strange, roots that didn't belong to the corn. They were thick and dark, tangled together like serpents, coiling around the crops, suffocating them. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized that these roots were not just from the plants. They were from something else, something much older. Suddenly, the wind picked up, howling through the field with unnatural force. The ground trembled beneath him, and the soil began to shift. Sam staggered back, panic rising in his chest as he saw a shadow move beneath the surface, something massive and powerful, pushing its way up from the earth. It was like a hand, but not a human hand, a monstrous, clawed thing, emerging from the soil, reaching toward him. He turned to run, but the ground beneath his feet seemed to pull him down, the earth shifting like a living thing. Sam's boots sank into the soil, and he felt something grabbing at his ankles, something cold and unyielding. He screamed, struggling to free himself, but the more he fought, the deeper he was pulled into the ground. When Sam woke, he was in his bed, drenched in sweat. His chest heaved as he gasped for breath, the remnants of the nightmare still fresh in his mind. The room was dark, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. For a moment, he thought it had all been a dream, but then he saw the dirt. It was smeared across his hands, caked under his nails. And when he looked down at his feet, they were covered in the same dirt, the same soil he had seen in the field. A sharp knock on the door made him jump. He groggily got up, wiping his hands on his pants, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Sam? You awake in there?" It was Henry, his old neighbor, the one who had helped him after he'd moved back into the farm. Sam opened the door, his mind still foggy with confusion. Henry's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Something's wrong with the crops, Sam," Henry said, his voice trembling. "I've never seen anything like it. The plants, there's something wrong with them. It's like they're alive." A chill ran down Sam's spine as he remembered the roots in the field. The strange sensation that something had been moving beneath the soil. He nodded, a sense of dread settling in his stomach. "Let's go check it out," Sam said, his voice strained. Together, they walked through the fields, the silence between them heavy with tension. As they approached the cornfield, Sam could see what Henry was talking about. The crops were no longer standing tall. They had collapsed into twisted heaps, as though something had ripped them from the earth. And beneath them, the soil was moving, writhing like a living thing. It was as though something deep below had awoken, and it was hungry. Sam dropped to his knees, his heart pounding as he saw the unmistakable signs of something far worse than any crop failure. The earth had been torn apart, and in its place was a massive hole, a black void that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. It was as if the land itself was trying to swallow everything whole. A low growl rumbled from deep within the pit, a sound that shook the very air around them. Sam's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. The farm wasn't just cursed, it was feeding something. Henry backed away, his face twisted in terror. "We need to leave, Sam. This isn't just a bad harvest. This is something worse." But Sam couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the ground, as if the very earth was claiming him. The soil began to crack open, and from the depths of the pit, something began to rise. It was a creature, a massive, grotesque thing, covered in dark, matted soil. Its body was a twisted mass of roots and vines, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. The air around it grew thick with the stench of decay, and Sam could feel its presence pressing down on him, suffocating him with its weight. The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth that gleamed like broken glass. It let out a deafening roar, and the ground shook beneath Sam's feet. He turned to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The earth beneath him shifted, and before he could react, the creature's roots lashed out, wrapping around his body, pulling him toward the pit. "No, please," Sam screamed, his voice lost in the wind. But the creature wasn't listening. It was hungry, and it was feeding on the land, on the very essence of the farm. And Sam, unwittingly, had been its caretaker. Sam awoke once again, but this time it wasn't the soft comfort of his bed that greeted him. Instead, he found himself in the heart of the farm, at the center of the pit. The creature's roots had released their grip, but only to drag him deeper into the earth. His surroundings were suffocating, the walls of soil closing in on him, blocking out the light. The creature stood before him, its eyes locked on his. It spoke, but its voice was not human. It was ancient, a language older than time itself. Sam couldn't understand the words, but he felt their weight, their power, pressing against his mind. "You are the last," the creature whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. The last of the bloodline. Sam's heart raced as the truth dawned on him. His family had been bound to the farm, to the curse that had been planted centuries ago. The land was a living, breathing thing, and his blood had nourished it, unknowingly feeding the creature that lay beneath. The creature stepped forward, its massive, gnarled hands reaching for Sam's chest. "It is time for the final harvest," and as its claws sank into Sam's flesh, the earth around him began to tremble once again. The roots reached for him, wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into the pit. And with one final scream, Sam was swallowed by the earth, his soul claimed by the very land he had tried to escape.